Stay right there. What are you waiting for? Kill him! Kill them both! No, wait a minute. Is it money you're after? I'll give you as much as you want.
May the saints forgive you, because I won't.
So this is part 2 with Paul Fredric of the Demonosophy podcast, and I'm joined by my co-host and Grey Lodge brother, Solar Exile. Thank you, Solar, for joining, and I'm really excited. Our last episode, as I was telling Paul pre-recording, did really good numbers, which is always nice to see, and I had a great time, and I thought we had a great discussion. So I'm very excited to continue part 2, and of course, Paul has an extensive bio. I'll let him sort of give the framework for how he wants to identify, introduce himself. But thank you so much, Paul, and I really appreciate it. And Solar, if you want to say anything, you're more than welcome to.
No, just happy to be here. So, Paul, what have you been up to since we last spoke with you?
Hey, well, thank you, Jen, and thank you, Solar, for having me back on again. We had a great conversation last time. I got lots of really good feedback on it from the people in my network. So I'm really looking forward to expanding on some of this stuff, maybe. So one of the things that I had thought that I wanted to talk a little bit about is I have been, well, I've already embarked on a production of something that may at some point resemble another book. And a lot of this has to do with kind of a lot of the things we talked about last time with my previous book, Second Awakening, and the kind of experiences I had with that and how that kind of represented a metanoia for my path through all of this stuff. And what's coming out of that is sort of a structure, like a structure that kind of moves in with all of this. Because one of the things that I experienced, and I talk about this, I think you can see this in Second Awakening, like my experience that I went through, kind of immediately like had this big deep dive into Chinese Nidan, Daoism, Secret of the Golden Flower, and all of that. And, you know, that's what that book is about. It's an exegesis of that book. But as I'm going through writing the book and correlating all of these experiences and stuff like that, I'm necessarily reaching out to all these other things, all these other cultural influences, you know, and I'm finding, you know, stuff with Zoroastrianism and correspondences with, you know, Orthodox Desert Fathers and all of this sort of thing. And it's interesting. It seems like there's this phenomenon that as we get we find some kernel of truth and we're drawn towards it, there's inevitably this cultural framework that is kind of wrapped around it, right? Takes us back into history, and then we start talking about history and stuff like that. And at the same time, as we delve into this, another culture, sometimes an ancient culture that really we can't really get to at all, there's always an inertia. There's an inertia or a push resistance or push pull between whatever culture we actually exist in, the culture that I'm actually in, for me, it's whatever English speaking people in the state of Texas in America, and figure out what that culture is from there. So this question that emerges is what is behind that? Because you see these correspondences and there's like something behind it all. And in a large extent, this is what my next work is dealing with, that and also a drill down into some of into some of the practices that have emerged as a result of that. And I'm kind of like talking about this in terms of esoteric solarism and the idea that there is a solar hierarchy to things. So just to unpack that a little bit, we start with like the sun, right? Just the sun that is at the center of our solar system, and how that is a source of life for pretty much everything that we're aware of, and pretty much all of the planets and everything in the solar system that we're aware of is dependent on this for, if not for light and photosynthesis for organic life, and there's like gravitation, which is keeping things in line. And so, of course, you see a lot of solar worship and stuff. We could talk about all these different cultures in history that have all these theories about the sun and stuff like that. So the other thing that I'm looking at in this is a more esoteric idea that you find in some schools and some systems, that there is a sun behind the sun. So this is called different things. It's called sun absolute, or super sun, or maybe black sun. And then there's other ideas behind this. And so the idea is, well, our sun is a star. We believe this pretty strongly now, that is the case, that all the other stars up there, those are all suns. Those are all other suns. And so what is keeping all of the suns in this same sort of order, the same sort of harmony, what Pythagoras calls music of the spheres, right? There's some sort of order which keeps everything solid. 'Cause we look up in the sky every night, and lots of people have been looking up at the sky for a long time, and we don't see the stars changing in relation to each other. So there's some sort of like order. And so this idea of sun absolute is this idea that there's this whatever central force or source of that order, which is keeping all of that together, is in what I'm starting to establish here is this hierarchy behind our sun. Then, and just to kind of simplify this, because there's lots more in betweens of it, but like the next step, I would say, in this hierarchy from an absolute is we talk about fire, just like ordinary fire that we, experience, that we can, light a candle, and how this is something which partakes of the essence of the sun, which partakes of the essence of sun absolute. So already there's this hierarchy being established, and then there's this whole other level of esoteric teaching that goes along just with fire, which Zoroastrianism is a great example of this. The way fire is considered sacred. Fire is it's like a representation of the sun. It's also a representation of sun absolute, because this idea of sun absolute, whatever is this ultimate source of order, is that's equivalent with the idea of Ahura Mazda, sun absolute, God the absolute. So we have fire as this next level, and there's a lot more we can talk about with that. Like Zoroastrianism, they talk about there's different kinds of fire with that. There's even yet another hierarchy within that. And so then the next level that I am highlighting in this study is the solar plexus, and this takes us into the inner world of man. And the solar plexus there's fire associations, there's sun associations with. Obviously, there's sun associations with it, right? It's called the solar plexus, so there's something solar about it in an internal kind of way. So that kind of in a nutshell is this idea of solar hierarchy, and it's beyond just like microcosm macrocosm, which kind of just like the model of microcosm macrocosm kind of just leaves us with it. It's kind of dualistic, right? It's kind of dualistic, and this is like sort of like more of the idea of a hierarchy kind of takes us away from thinking about dualistically about things. But then this general hierarchy that I'm talking about, then this sort of like ends up feeding and inspiring and different cultural evolutions that occur around this, and I'm kind of focusing on specific historical cultural areas of this. First of all, the Persian area, which which connects with Indian, right? This whole Indo-Aryan, Indo-European sort of movement, and then Egyptian, ancient Chinese, and then wherever all these other where this line came from, possibly before these areas started to come into being.
Can I
Solar,
just ask a
sorry
quick
about that. Yeah, go
follow-up?
for it.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to butt in to make sure I have a kind of full conceptual picture of sort of what you're thinking about. So does this like as we sort of go up this, I don't want to say chain of being explicitly to tie it to Platonic ideas, but to this sort of like the higher sun, the sun absolute, we get to this point of Ahura Mazda, maybe as sort of like pristine, pure consciousness or something like that. Does this highest thing, which, as you said, sort of is the sort of fundamental anchor of of our sort of cosmological universe, does this also anchor certain sort of conceptual ideas, certain forms, like maybe what we're used to thinking about in the sort of classical Western context of the true, the beautiful, and ultimately the good? Like, does this highest thing serve to kind of fix and anchor those things as well, and give us some abilities to sort of partake in those ideas, in those energies, etc.? Or is this like, am I on the right track, or is that kind of not part of what you're proposing?
I think you're totally on the right track. Um, so there's a lot of ancient Greek stuff that comes up with this, and Plato definitely, um, I think definitely is in line with this. So um, we talk about the cave allegory, okay, and the idea, just to paraphrase the cave allegory, the idea is that man's state is that we're chained in the bottom of a cave, chained to look just at the wall, and there's lights dancing around on the wall, or shadows dancing around on the wall, and since we can't look around and we've never seen anything else, we consider that reality. So behind that, behind those behind the people that are chained looking at the wall, then there's there's like another group of people who they're holding up little stick puppets and stuff like that, and behind them is like a fire, right? And so the fire is like creating this like these shadows against the wall, and these people are holding up these stick puppets and whatever, creating like these images which the people who are chained up think is reality. So in Plato's story, the only way that we ever get out of this situation is through philosopher kings, or some kind of intervention. Something comes through to help us out. So a couple of things you realize as you're moving out of the cave is that, well, the people behind you making the images are like, they think that these are the people in the world that think that they're like really clever, and they're like manipulating and controlling everything, but they don't realize they're also in the cave. They're also in Maya. They're also in the world of illusion. They're also in the Druge, which is a thing that that comes up in Buddhism, that comes up in a lot of systems where it's like, well, the gods, whether you're talking about the Vedic or whatever, pagan gods, they're actually down here with us. They're in the cave with us still. They're actually still in Maya. Well, that's why we read the stories about the gods in mythology. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're evil. They're not like morally committed, right? They're still suffering from all the same problems that we have. But anyhow, the next thing we see when we're leaving the cave is there's that fire, right? You see fire from what the shadows were done. But then there's also going to be this other light, which is the light from outside the cave that comes in. So there's a light that's like behind the immediate light of fire. And so the next thing that happens is then you emerge from the cave, and Plato talks about, and this is all in Plato's Republic, and he talks about how emerging from the cave, that the light of the sun as it hits your eyes for the first time will be very, very harsh and very painful, but eventually you grow accustomed to it. And this is like, Plato's analogy for you become accustomed to noesis, to what things look like in a higher state of consciousness. And I'm glad you mentioned the good, true, and the beautiful, because this really connects with, right if you read the Republic, right after he talks about the cave allegory and establishes this higher reality, these forms, he talks about three forms: the good, the true, and the beautiful. And the true and the beautiful are, by themselves. Truth and beauty can go either way, right? They can go either way. Sometimes the truth hurts, you know. How many wars are started for truth? And beauty is in the eye of the beholder and can create resentment and all of this stuff. But the idea is that the form of the good, he actually can see this is like the higher form. This is the form that illuminates the true and the beautiful. And a lot of that, and I think you could say this about a lot of other forms you could talk about, that ultimately it's this form of the good that illuminates and shines on him. And he's really clearly using this, that emerging from the cave, seeing the sun, that is like seeing the ultimate form of good, the ultimate principle of good.
Okay, I've got a couple things for you, Paul. I don't want to monopolize, however. So I want to first ask you stellar versus asterism. Now, I know this is a big question, and obviously I come from a more Jyotisha or tantric astrology perspective. So in that system, we preference the stars, like the stellar worship or stellar veneration, or like understanding them to be supernal to the planets. Would you agree with that or disagree?
So we're trying to establish what is the role of the stars in relation to.
Do they exist in the hierarchy higher than the planets, or are they at the same sort of cosmological level?
So they would be kind of like at a higher level than the planets. And another thing that I'm drawing on here is what Gurdjieff talks about as what he calls the ray of creation, which is another way of looking at all of these ideas. And so you just kind of look at it in terms of what things are beholden to, beholden to, and within our solar system, the planets are beholden to our sun, and then all suns are beholden to, within their own like hierarchy. It's like there's a hierarchy of the stars, all of the stars taken together. In other words, you're talking about all galaxies, all cosmoses, is kind of over the hierarchy of our sun and our particular solar system, as things sort of branch off. You know what I mean? We have the same thing happens as the sun comes down onto planet Earth and the world of man. It branches off into each of us individually within our own internal universe. So there's like a branching off of this hierarchy as you go down, descending from it. But as you go upwards, ascending to it, there is a joining. There is a joining to return to that original source. So the stars are outside. I mean, all of the stars are outside of, our solar system. They're outside of our immediate, sphere within, the solar system. So they're kind of above in that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It makes sense to me a lot. And I wanted to just mention that in tantric astrology, at least, there is a dragon who is a shadow planet behind the sun, the Ketu, or Ketu, as I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So that is quite interesting. And he would be the black sun because he is likened to a piece of obsidian or hessonite sometimes. And but you're supposed to hold you're supposed to hold the gemstone of the planet up to a candle and see if the blazing light for the flashing light from behind. And then that is the representation of the graha. So I always found that very interesting because he's more associated with black, especially in tantric astrology, than he is with blue, which would be more Saturnian. I just want to note that, but you use the Plato's cave allegory. And I wondered if you were familiar with the story, I'm sure you are, of Samantabhadra and Samantabhadra, who are sort of like the primordial cosmic Buddhas from like 10 million years ago, or a different multiverse, or, a different, different realm structure even. But they are often said to be in their the Samantabhadra Manlam, which is like a recitation prayer that you do for 49 days, especially if someone's passed away. And one of the things in that prayer is it describes like them sitting in this cave, and the sand beneath them is diamonds, and the lower part of the wall is lapis lazuli, and the highest part of the wall is turquoise, and there is an opening, and there is sun coming through that is illuminating the diamonds, but it is exactly like you said, something else. It's also their own self-illumination. So I should say that. So maybe you could say that is the actual flame, but the light is representative of like the infinite possibility for like to the infinite capacity for that flame to grow. So I thought that was very interesting and wanted to know if you were aware of that.
No, I was not aware of it, but that I'm very interested in that. And it's just once I started looking at things in these terms, it's like you see it everywhere. And so much of I'm trying to make a distinction here, and I have for a while, and certainly struggle with it myself, but to make a distinction between an esoteric perspective, in other words, to mean what is the higher meaning behind this, rather than to contrast that with an occultism of it, which an occultish version of it in my book ends up taking it towards a more fun with correspondences, right? Like, oh, this corresponds with that, this corresponds with that, right? That doesn't go anywhere. But if we go into the esoteric meaning of these things, then we're trying to kind of rise above and try and see, like in that Platonic Noetic sense, to try and see where this higher light is coming from. What is the source of it? What is the origin of it?
Well, the sad reality of it is that correspondences and novelty, especially paired together, sell books, I think, or at least a fair number of books, right? Like I was very close to jumping in a minute ago to say, hey, isn't it funny how sort of viewed from another angle, you could talk about the black sun as the sort of lower, as the sort of like self-illuminating light that serves as the sort of lowest octave of the Saturn daimonium. It's kind of the basis of, sort of like self-consciousness, blah, 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 all this stuff, right? Like you can brand these very, very like analogous concepts, like in sort of new and interesting ways to carve out different market segments, essentially, right? To sort of like tailor this to new people. And I'm not saying that like that's not valuable, right? Or that, there's not perhaps something to be gained by speaking the language, of people who are, possibly receptive to ideas and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, it's, I think, striving towards a more sort of structural and schematic understanding of these things, as well as something that can actually be translated into practice and experiential growth, right? With a minimum of kind of the accoutrements of knowledge and complexity and abstraction, right? Like the sort of like cognitive stuff that goes on top of the work to give it direction and orientation and to make it make sense. You need some of that, obviously. You can't just say, go meditate or something, and expect, everything to happen. But yeah, it's tough because in a lot of ways, the market kind of incentivizes not super helpful and productive stuff at the end of the day,
No, it really does. And I hate to sound like I'm judging it, because I'm guilty of this too. I mean, this is just something that we go through as our struggle, right? I mean, of collecting information, collecting ideas, seeking the truth. We find correspondences, and it's like, oh wow. But then, I mean, if you go on TikTok and scroll through it, it's like every like, young person who finds out that a new correspondence is something is making a video now about, well, the real correspondence of this is that, and you see it and you just realize that that in some sense this doesn't take you out. It doesn't take you out of the cave, right? This takes you back to where, oh, now I'm going to move back here and be the guy that makes shadows on the wall to try and keep the other people, glued to the wall, watching the shadows. And that wall is so that symbolism of Plato's is so prophetic, because it sounds. I mean, you read it, it just sounds like he's talking about a TV screen, or he's talking about scrolling on an iPhone. It's just so familiar, but there's so much of that well, really, all of 777 and other Kabbalistic writings. Well, we're really just still in the cave. We might be having more fun in here, but we haven't really moved out of it yet. Because when we move out of it, it's painful, and you lose a lot from that. You lose more than you gain as far as like stuff and things, okay? And that's part of the experience of it. Part of the experience is coming into this awareness that so much of the things that we're gaining and ideas that we're gaining are really they're really just part of personality. They're really just part of the ego, and they really, tempt us to just stay focused on that and follow it around, and our attention gets absorbed into it. So the real struggle is to see beyond that. And I don't think that it really happens. It doesn't happen because someone reads a book about it. It's not going to happen because someone, is reading, reads the book that I'm writing about it either. It only happens based on a real inner experience that is connected with what we call conscience. And one of the things that So this also comes back to me the idea of moral relativism versus what they say in Western philosophy, moral relativism versus moral absolutism or moral objectivism, or the idea that the real simple idea is there an objective good, right? Is there objective good and evil? Does that really exist? Or is it just what people do? People judge things that way, and so people do.
And if I could
Yeah.
insert like another piece of that, and I think it's going to be directly relevant to our
Yeah.
discussion, right? Like, is there something actually like objective, right? For these types of things, but also, do we have access to it, right? So it's the epistemic question, right? Because it's one thing if we say, yes, there is like sort of an objective reality out there, but we, for whatever reason, perceptually, conceptually, whatever, have no way of approaching that in any meaningful way, right? And thus we're sort of tumbling back down the mountain into this kind of like post-structural malaise, right? That we can't seem to
Yeah.
get out of, right?
Yeah.
Because, and this is relevant too, right? Because like Plato and some of these other, thinkers, mystic traditions all over, many of them are going to say, yes, there is a sort of way things are, However, that can only be experienced by us in a, at best, kind of like numinous way, right? In a way that completely transcends conceptual elaboration, any kind of like rational thought formation, right? And so it's going to be this constant kind of process of approaching that numinous absolute, but in a way that doesn't just like, that there's going to be kind of a nuanced and complex process of translation from those experiences, from that access, then bringing that sort of that energy and that knowledge, translating that sort of back down into the world of the material, the conceptual, the social, et cetera, right? Which is its own kind of can of worms. So there's kind of like two parts to that,
Yeah, and you said something really, really relevant here, is that even if I decide, yeah, there's objective good and objective evil, what I find is that I'm unable to live in accordance with it, right? We find ourselves doing the wrong thing. We see the wrongness all over, and so the temptation, it's really easy to say, well, fuck it, it doesn't exist then. So the idea of that existence, like I said, it doesn't come by an understanding of information. It comes from it comes from feeling, and it comes from conscience, and it comes for a wish for that more than anything else, rather than a belief in it being true or not. And if you look at like the evolution of these, so I mean, the classic philosophers, and Plato and Aristotle agreed. They had their disagreements, but they agreed on the good, the true, and the beautiful, and these fundamental things, and that was really the basis of a lot of Western, the evolution of Western philosophy. And people argue about this. If you look just in straight up philosophy, a lot of people say, well, when like Kant and the German philosophers Hegel, etc., they sort of damage this. They're the ones who like said, well, no, actually we can't know. Like Kant said, we can't know. We can't verify that there's anything objective. But our internal structure is wired for it. So Kant tried to stay cool with the idea that there's objective good. But ultimately, the other Nietzsche and all the other like subsequent philosophers, they rode with this. No, we can't verify anything objectively. Therefore, there's not any objective good, and we have to create good. That's what it means. Nietzsche's will to power is we just have to create it. Now, some people say that really, it's that they like to look at Machiavelli. Like Machiavelli's The Prince, which is, what is that, like 15th or 16th century. Machiavelli says, all that stuff about good and evil is that's just for the people who don't know any better. But for princes, there's a different law, right? So some people, and academically, the way people take Machiavelli is, oh yeah, well you just switch back and forth between sometimes I believe there's objective good, but if it's not appropriate, I'm going to believe there's not objective good. Well, what that really means is that you don't believe there's objective good. If you believe there's objective, that it's objective, then you don't have the ability to just like switch off, right? If it's objective, it's still there. So Machiavelli kind of says this without saying it. I mean, he kind of like said, no, that all that good and evil stuff is bullshit. But I don't know. Did that address what you said?
Oh yeah. I do think there's kind of an interesting if you want to like sort of look at Machiavelli, at least on the surface level, kind of from a dharmic perspective, you kind of get an interesting analysis, right? Because like the purpose of that work, at least as I read it, it's been a while since I read it, is basically how can we maintain virtue ethics from the perspective of a prince. Or the prince is, definitionally someone whose duty as a prince is going to be to have to do things for the maintenance of the big picture good as defined by sort of that particular role, right? Like the good of the city state, his people, all of these things. He is going to have to commit potentially monstrous acts. And it's not exactly that there isn't, that good and evil sort of like cease to exist, or that he sort of like enters a frame in which those coordinates no longer apply, but it's simply that his duty obligates him to have sort of like different limits, right? That like the scope of his action and will is such that he has his responsibilities push him to do things that the the carpenter will never have to do, moral dilemmas and situations that they will never have to consider, let alone like live out, right? But however, that it would be a grave abrogation of duty to say, well, this is too much. This puts me in too compromised of a position. I'm going to pass. I'm not going to send tens of thousands of men off to war to die to defend the realm. I'll just give it away, right? Kind of the the Arjuna chapter 1 approach to, I don't really want to do this thing, Krishna. Let me off the ride. And so I think it's an interest, and that's interesting kind of from a Dharmic perspective, Machiavelli's perspective, because it's very much embedding, it's staying, at least on, again, surface level. I hope Jin can, I think I see where the correction will come, setting you up a little bit. At the surface level, it appears to sort of embed the individual, the prince, let's say, into that samsaric role, right? It's saying that this positionality, right, this social position, this sort of position of moral responsibility is real, is fixed, this duty is real, and that it's sort of like, it serves to further entrench those beliefs, the grasping at that as real, self-existing, et cetera, right? And that leads to very maybe different ethical conclusions, perhaps, than approaching that situation from a less fixed kind of Dharmic perspective,
So I would say, I don't think Machiavelli, I mean, he definitely didn't have the Bhagavad Gita in mind when he wrote that. And what I think you're talking about is when the prescription for rulers was that, yeah, they have to do, a warlord has to do bad things, but he should temper it, like a good soldier, a good warrior, he tempers it with the good, true, and the beautiful. So you talk about this is all the stories about knights and stuff from Western literature, that no, you have to do rough things because life is tough, but you temper that with a belief in good. And Machiavelli really doesn't, he really doesn't say that. He really does not say that. He redefines virtue, basically. Like we would say, what are the noble virtues, right? Like good, true, the beautiful, or all these things. Always champion a good, just cause. Justice, all these sorts of things are like virtue. But Machiavelli redefines virtue, like really, really subtly. So there's a word in Italian, it's paradiastola, I think, something like that, which basically is the art of redefining, changing the meaning of word, using words, and it's a rhetorical technique. It's a Greco-Roman rhetorical technique, but he basically and Machiavelli uses this, right? He uses this a lot, and he redefines virtue as basically gaining power and keeping power, and that's it. And there's only two forces in the universe he talks about. He talks about virtue, and he talks about fortuna, right? Fortune or fate. And for him, the aim is to maximize virtue, which sounds good on the surface, but you have to remember he's been redefining it as gaining power, keeping power. But to maximize that virtue and minimize fate, to minimize any fortune or anything that is not within your power. So so this is kind of like kind of taking us into this realm of moral relativism, where if like there's not really any good or evil, and if good is only invoked when necessary, and this is all this is in Plato's Republic too. Like Plato's Republic, it starts out with in the dialogues, this one character Thrasymachus, who's a sophist. They're talking about how, you know, justice and what is the right thing to do and stuff. And Thrasymachus he concludes that might is right is the only way. Just getting the best that you can for yourself and evoking good when you need to, because, well, in society we want people to think that we're good, so you should behave good sometimes so people think that you're good. And this is basically what I feel that Machiavelli basically took like this early point of it, this early part of the dialogue, and that's what he's like working from. Whereas, you know, Plato then in this dialogue responding to this guy who suggests, you know, moral relativism is the way and might is right. The whole argument of the Republic is in response to this, is to contradict this. And what they go into is a discussion of justice. Like, what is we need to establish what justice is, and everything else comes from there. He says, well, we're going to talk about like a just city. Let's see what a just city is and compare that to man's soul. And then they go into the cave allegory and the good, the true, and beautiful, and all this other stuff. But to tie this back, the other thing that I was going to say about it is he essentially sets out like a three-tiered like kind of division of the soul, where the soul, like the three main components are temperance, courage, and wisdom. And if those three are in balance, it creates justice. But when he's talking about courage, he's talking about the heart, and he derives it from the heart. He talks about, you know, in a just society, it's like the heartfelt, the warriors, right? That exhibit courage, that have heart. So he's really talking about that, how like that's a key component to all of this, which kind of takes me back to the idea that this idea of a good, of an absolute principle of it, it's not something that we reach by reading about it and thinking about it and thinking, oh yeah, it's a good idea. It only comes about by some sort of like heartfelt kind of wish.
Okay, so I do have a follow-up, so not necessarily a solar, although I thought it was an excellent question, an excellent follow-up. I'm not going to correct you. I think there's different views to Dharma, and I'm trying to be more flexible in my mind, but I also, like, for me, I practice Buddha Dharma, so for me, I look at it like the Vedas, which might be actually part of my next question. I tend to look at it from that view. But I understand that that's imperfect hermeneutic. And as both of you were saying, perhaps the correspondences and correspondence matching is probably my Kabbalah brain, not necessarily the most practical. But why I do it actually is, Paul, is something I've been very interested in. Solar kind of knows this, is Zoroastrianism since the beginning of when I started podcasting. This question of Zoroastrianism, Manichaeanism, Mandeanism, and I was specifically thinking about how it intersected with Tantra, how it intersected with Daoism on the Silk Road. So this was something that I was like just very into at that moment. So I personally think that there is a degree of flexibility that has to be allowed, but there are tantras that do talk about like these different groups and how, like, if you follow those texts, and not everyone does, of course, because it's always a text-dependent practice, but how you're supposed to view them. So I take those kinds of things as on relative terms, but I also hold them to be somewhat true, or like to have gravity at least. So that is how I usually view them, but I actually like the parallels. I like seeing, okay, this came from Persia, this came from Zoroastrianism, and then we actually do this exact thing just like a Homa. Like I know in Santana Dharma, they practice homas, but we also practice tantric homas and fire pujas and all of those things. So it's very similar to me. So I try and look at it for those similarities, not because I'm necessarily correspondence matching, but I'm just looking for the sort of primordial seed, you could say. So okay, that was a long one. So in follow up to that, ray of creation, do you see this as having a Mithraic element, Paul?
So I'm not really well versed with Mithraism. I mean, I've read about it. And I know there's a hero and there's a solar aspect of it. And I think I mean, you guys probably know more than me about Mithraism, honestly. But I think that it also corresponds, just to come back to, like you mentioned, Sanatan Dharma and duty, that all of this connects with this idea of eternal order, which that's my favorite translation that I've seen of Sanatan Dharma, is eternal order, and that's in Ravi Ravindra's translation of the Bhagavad Gita. And the idea is that the order that, we're tracing back, like a lot of the things that we're talking about, we, can find like the origins of it in the Rig Veda. And that goes back a really long time, right? I mean, there's the elements of solar, very early solar worship, which possibly was happening in an Arctic region. And there is, there's Zoroastrian elements, there's Vedic elements, there's stuff that eventually goes and informs Buddhism and all these things. And well, where did that start? Well, it was like an oral tradition for, thousands of years before it was ever like written down in Sanskrit. And the origins of it just sort of vanish as we look backwards. They just sort of fade away into this eternal order. And that is like what we see. That is what we see when we just, look up at the night sky. There's so much that we don't know and can't know, but we can see that there's this order, that comes down to us, which, I think Dharma is another way of talking about order and our duty within that. And to get back to Bhagavad Gita, that's a lot of what I take out of that initial story in Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna and Krishna, and Arjuna doesn't want to go to war. It has to do with that duty, and we get that sense of our duty by perceiving this eternal order and trying to understand our place in it, right? Like where we're put in the universe, where we arise in the universe, who we know, who our soulmates are, who our family is, who fortune has like connected us with, and that's our duda, that's our dharma.
That was great, Paul. Thank you for that. I just want to respond by saying I asked you the Mithras question, but because we have a practice in Tantric Buddhism called Marici. So she's originally a Zoroastrian Deva. So that's why I asked about that, because she descends invisibly, very interesting, carrying the thread, the golden thread of Dharma with her in one of her fingers, as well as a sewing needle. So she ties sort of the karma of the planets to our individual sort of like light bodies. So I find that interesting. And obviously she's tied to the Little Dipper. She's kind of the torque that turns the wheel of time. And she's just an important goddess. And I just think that it's an interesting concept when we're talking about like the secret sun behind the sun, because she is like invisible, ungraspable, and invincible light. But it's emergent from the darkness. It's not it's not like it's not from a luminary. So I always found that very interesting. But then that goes into my actual question: Devas versus Asuras, the Vedic versus Zoroastrian sort of paradox. How do you reconcile that, Paul? And do you have any like thoughts on how we can understand the Asuras or the Ahuras or the Devas, or like what happened in Zarathustra's sort of reformation?
So, my general understanding of that is within Zoroastrianism, he's kind of like, he's kind of making this statement that the gods, like I was saying earlier, the gods are in Druge, right? They're kind of part of the, they're within Maya, and really there's this higher principle we need to look through. But at the same time, Zoroastrianism has then this idea that there's these other entities that they call yazatas, which are, it kind of looks like gods, to me. But substantially, the yazatas are also include the Fravashis, they include, people who come to Earth and fought the good fight and then return, and through good thoughts, good words, good deeds, and all of the work encompassed in that, return to the realm of the yazatas. So there's this cycle that's really consistent with this solar hierarchy within that we come, humans descend from the absolute, from the sun absolute, to fight the good fight. And what is that good fight? Well, when we're on Earth, we are basically transformer stations of transforming this solar energy, which is another thing that I think is an important point here, is that this energy and this light, which creates photosynthesis, also has additional things that it does to the oxygen that we breathe, that we can receive out of that oxygen when we learn to, let's just say, breathe more consciously, to keep it simple right now. But we're transforming this energy, and we're staying off the corruption. See, there's corruption that infects this level, right? The other thing we established with this whole solar hierarchy is we're very, and if that's a principle of good, we are in fact very far away from it. We are very far away from it. Why is that? Because we're needed here at this point, somewhere on the edge of all of this unfolding of creation is where the darkness begins, and the chaos or the corruption starts to kind of encroach upon it. So organic life appears at this level away from it to transform energy and stave off that corruption, fight the good fight, if you will, and return that energy back towards the absolute, right? So there's that ascending and descending current, yin yang, evolution and involutionary currents going on here as well. And so in Vedic, and this is all unclear, and I talk about this a little bit in the book. So I had a really great conversation with some some Parsi priests in Mumbai, and this is on a Reddit group that I was on for Zoroastrianism, about this, the relationship with like the Vedic stuff. And what I heard is that you got to understand, no, it's not just the Vedic stuff didn't just come from Zoroastrianism, and Zoroastrianism didn't just come from Vedic stuff. There's this long line of this teaching, again, eternal order, that you can trace back through the Rig Veda, that is like gone on for centuries, and these different things have like come out from it. So I thought that was interesting, because I didn't get as clear of a cutoff as I imagined it. We like to imagine things, conceive of things as being very linear and very clear and black and white, but reality isn't always like that. But but it is true that the word for the divas, in Zoroastrianism, it's like the divas are like demons. They're malevolent forces. They're associated with Angra Mainyu, the angry mind, which is it's a very human thing, very negative emotions, like kind of thing. Whereas like the divas in Vedic system, the in Hinduism, Vedas are the gods. But within Vedic, which is such a huge thing. I mean, it's just ridiculous to even sit here and trying to, sum it all up. It's so big. But the way I kind of look at it is that, well, and the way I've heard it described, which makes a lot of sense to me, is there's really, it starts out with Brahman, which is like, that's just the original. That's the, that's Sun Absolute, right? That's God the Absolute. God the Absolute splits into two forces, Shiva, Vishnu, or, if we look in, other systems, this happens in all these other systems, splits into two, creates a duality, that immediately creates a triad with the original force, and then things start to split apart, and this solar hierarchy, or, ray of creation, we're just saying that this is a similar like pattern is happening cosmologically. And
Sorry, Paul, can I just interrupt you for one sorry about that. My apologies.
Sure, yeah.
I wanted to comment on something you said that's quite profound, is that the division into Shiva and Vishnu. This is really interesting because this happened around the 2nd century, and we see Vishnu was originally called Narayana, the sleeping god.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously he's not really associated with the Vedas or the early Puranas, but some of his names like Krishna and Arjuna are. So those sort of became part of his worship. And interestingly, he actually absorbed the Surya, what we're calling, I'll call air quotes, tantras. They are actual tantras, but they stopped being practiced. And so he kind of absorbed the mythos, the lore, and perhaps some of the ritual elements, but not the sort of like transgressive tantric, like ritual worship components. But some of the ideas probably influenced the Shastras, which are the ritual sort of manuscripts. So I find that very interesting that you are so prescient on that subject, like time versus space, because this is like a sort of like a question, I guess, in a lot of like what I would call more dualistic religions, like how to understand God or the ineffable or the eternal. And I also think the Puranas actually relate Shiva, or Mahakala, as he became later known, and maybe this also relates to Jurvanism and like how that sort of like became the Zoroastrian sect focused on the Time King. And I've always thought there was a deep interrelationship between that, because Shiva is sort of the progenitor, the father of the Tantras in one way of thinking. So that is very interesting to me, not necessarily Shiva of the Puranas, but Rudra Bhairava of the actual Tantras. But you can understand them as being like you mentioned, the waking night sky or the sleeping day sky. So very interesting to me. I did have a question in there. I apologize. Paul, thank you for letting me do that.
Can I jump in with a quick question real quick? So for context, one of the sanghas that I'm part of, my Dzogchen sangha, we have an online presence. And so occasionally we get Advaitists who kind of wander in, right? Or people who don't clearly differentiate between Advaitin ideas and Buddha Dharma, right? And so I've personally gotten very used to kind of like cutting right to like the sort of philosophical distinctions between those two things, right? And I'm curious. So for me, as someone who also actively like practices or journeys down the left-hand path, this is something where, to me, with my notions of sort of like isolate intelligence, or the sort of like the fundamental discreteness of the mind stream, of the mind, of awareness, that kind of falls on one side of that. So there's a compatibility there between at least my understanding and my practice of my left-hand path stuff with Dzogchen or Buddha Dharma broadly. And then on the other side of that, there's the kind of, well, people, practitioners of Sanatana Dharma very broadly, and then Advaitists kind of also, I don't know how we want to lump those people together. But they understand the sort of like return to the absolute, the return to the one, that unity, that fundamental like move towards unity with Brahman in a very different way, right? Where ultimately that sort of distinction between like self and Brahman sort of goes away, right? As the end of the path. And so I'm really interested to ask you, and whether you want to again stick to kind of Vedic context, or whether you want to take it back to the context of like what the sort of endpoint of the Fravashi is, as it kind of like works towards the perfection of the world with Ahura Mazda or whatever, but also as someone who has practiced, has been on the left-hand path for decades, someone who's very, very steeped in that and in that sort of conceptual language of isolate intelligence. In how you're conceiving of things now, is there the preservation of that sort of autonomy and sort of like agency and sort of that sort of self-contained nature of mind? Or have you moved kind of in a different direction away from that type of thinking?
So principle of isolate intelligence and principle of self-consciousness, let's say, and that's a very important concept in Setian ideas, and as I conceive of that now, consciousness, it's kind of like the true or the beautiful, and people talk about this all the time, right? Consciousness. Is it necessarily good? Well, look at all the bad things that people do, right? And so there's this question about it. So I believe that there is this that it's one of those things that when the light is shined on it, when it connects with this fundamental principle of good, that's what qualifies it. That's what really illuminates it. And I don't see like the suggestion that there is a loss of self in that, right? Or a loss of autonomy, or a loss of who we are. Clearly our whole idea of what autonomy, individuality means is going to change really significantly when the physical body dies. There's going to be some other kind of like process along with that. But even like a lot of the mythology and like different teachings on it don't really indicate that there's this blending, this absorption. Absorption, I think, is the word that you hear a lot with this, that the isolate intelligence or the individual consciousness becomes absorbed by it. But I do think as a part of this growth process, the individual does inevitably lose a lot, like I was talking about earlier. But the things that are lost are these aspects of the ego, which are the parts of ourselves that are actually false and not really real, and really just junk that we've picked up along the way, stuff that we react to and take very internally. But that ultimate journey is towards that fundamental principle of the good. I mean, that's what's really needed in order to just illuminate consciousness into being at a higher state. About objective consciousness, or even like self-consciousness. There needs to be this sort of illumination, this sort of nourishment that happens there. And again, this is like Zoroaster. What does everyone in the world know that Zoroastrians like to say at this point in time? Good thoughts, good words, good deeds. A tripartite formula. I'm saying everyone knows this now because the Queen movie, or the Freddie Mercury movie, like made a big deal about his Zoroastrianism. Good thoughts, good words, good deeds. Clearly, this ancient teaching is like always been geared towards this idea of the higher, and that higher is fundamentally good. I mean, why would it be evil, right? If you say, oh, it's not a good, then you're locking yourself in the room with moral relativism, basically. And one of the things that we talked about earlier was Milarepa. And I read that book, Life of Milarepa, a while back. And I went back and I read it again. There's so much in there. And something about this like really resonated with me. And more so than a lot of the, I've read different other like, sutras and stuff. But there's something about the Life of Milarepa really got me. And what it is like conscience. And some people have said to me before that, Buddhism and Eastern systems are fundamentally moral relativism. And I might not be the best person to comment on this, but I don't feel that that's like really the case. So that's not what the feeling I got with Milarepa, because his whole process, and Milarepa talks about how when he was young, he his father dies, his family he has all of his estate stolen and everything, and his mom makes him swear to learn black magic and exact revenge on the people that stole their estate. And you must do this, or I will commit suicide in front of you. So Milarepa takes it really seriously, and he goes out and he finds a black magic school and he learns black magic. And eventually he uses it. He comes back and he kills there was like two people that ripped him off, a husband and wife, but he like gets an ice storm on them while they're having a party. And so like their whole family gets like killed. And this is like later on, part of his experience is his conscience, the realization that he had done all this is what turns him in a different direction, and starts seeking for something else, seeking something higher, seeking towards the good. So I think there's something universal about the path, and it's a good thing.
I personally love the example of Milarepa, Paul, simply because of what you said. He was a sorcerer and he learned Tantra, like early Nyingma Tantra, from other, what we would call I would call it like a Lursi, like a Thai shaman who wears the tiger skin, or a Dukun from Indonesia. But it's a similar idea. Like these men on the mountain, householders, would have small books of spells, tantras, sort of. They are tantras, but they were using them for like village, what we call like abacharya, black magic. So that's exactly what happened. And it's so interesting because the tantra he actually learns and uses is actually considered to be like a Buddhist practice, if you have like a Buddhist sort of like state of mind while you're doing it. So you can invoke those ideas, but it's really about, as you said, consciousness. It's about clearing like the sort of obstacles and obscurations of the mind. That's what the deity is supposed to do. The deity isn't necessarily real or not real. That's not necessarily the emphasis, but the emphasis is of their sort of the form they take to remove the obstacles from the upasaka's path. And so what I find profound about Milarepa is he actually built the tower I'm sure you know this, Paula, but he built the 40 years it took him to build this tower of stones, and he kept redoing it because the teacher was like, you're it's not good. It's not ready.
Yeah.
But the platform, the tower, again, it is similar to like the Parsis in a way, like the Tower of Silence. But one of the ideas of understanding what he was actually building was the sort of platform to practice Vajrasattva. So Vajrasattva is like a purifying practice, like to purify your karmas. So when you do the Vajrasattva sadhana, he is the center flame. He's the turquoise flame, exactly like a Parsi temple. And so there would be like 4 pillars and then a central flame. But then you also recognize that maybe the upasaka yourself is also the flame. So there's like maybe something non-dual in there, but it's a very interesting idea. And there's another Mahasiddha, and all the Mahasiddhas are like this. They all have like, it's not dalliances necessarily, but they all practice black magic at one time or another, or they gain higher cities, and then they're able to sort of perform both miracles and sorcery as they will it. So, but all of them sort of recognize this like path of right action, right speech, and right thoughts, because that is like obviously a big part of like Buddhism and Dharma and in general.
Yeah. No, it totally is. I mean, so do you think do you think it's accurate to say then that it is not moral relativism?
I just think of the truth as being the objective truth, like Dharma, Buddha Dharma, obviously. Right. I think of that as being the objective reality.
Right.
And then everything else is relative. However, the way that I would understand negotiating this is called upaya, like skillfulness. And upaya in the tantric meaning, it requires you to have a higher consciousness. Like you can't just be me, Jin, like who's a tantric, but like I would just call myself like a sorcerer on the carnal ground. That's my sort of bit. But if you are like more of a serious, like maybe a monastic, but you don't have to be, but there are people who have a higher realization maybe. At that point, maybe they are able to negotiate what new upaya is and use upaya skillfulness to negotiate what morality is. But for most Buddhists, like for most people who practice like Mahayana, most people who practice Vajrayana even, and definitely people who are Theravadan, they are sticking to those sort of like the 3 roots of like right action, right speech, and right mind.
Yeah.
Even in like so just in my practice, which takes this very, very like absolute view, right? Dzogchen, Adi Yoga, it's just like, which is a funny thing to jump into, like skipping the decades of tantric practice that traditionally would sort of lead up to that, right? Even then it's like a cliche, right? Like, don't lose the view in the conduct, don't lose the conduct in the view. The idea being that those sort of like moral guidelines, as well as just the frameworks and kind of your ability to sort of navigate the world in that skillful way, exactly what Jin's talking about. If you're so caught up in conceptual elaborations around the view, which is this sort of this very like absolute perspective, that you're unable to sort of like function, or you're going completely off the rails behaviorally and stuff like that. Like that's not it. You're in fact, again, you're sort of like succumbing to conceptual ideas about something that's fundamentally non-conceptual, and then using that to excuse doing whatever the hell you want, etc. Again, not that there's not a place for the so-called crazy wisdom, etc. But like by and large, we also have like millennia of evidence to show that as people go deeper into this practice, and I mean all Buddha Dharma, right? More or less, like we tend to see the same kind of behavioral tendencies, the same like impulses, the same types of activities, enlightened activities, manifesting throughout all these different various lives across different cultural, historical contexts and things like that, right? Like there's no guy who reaches this high level of attainment and then goes and becomes like Jeffrey Dahmer or whatever, right? Like there are clearly some like consistencies, even if we're just being like scientific about it and collecting reams of data without being prescriptive, without appealing to what the scriptures say, what the commentaries, have to say about these things, but even just like observationally, like there are clearly consistencies here. Whatever conclusions you want to draw from that.
Well, one of my favorite Mahasiddhas is Virupa. So I've talked to you a little bit about this, Solar, and I thought that was an excellent point, and I don't necessarily disagree. Obviously, I practice Anuttara Yoga, so the way I think of Dharma is that they are all equal: Adi Yoga, Anuttara Yoga, and Ati Yoga, which is like the internal practices. I consider those all part of like the broad part of Buddha Dharma, obviously, and but Virupa is really interesting because he never transgressed, really. His transgression was superficial. It was to get kicked out of the monastery, because what he recognized in the monastic situation, he was having magical experiences where a Dakini called Naraitmya, whose name means she without self, would visit him at night. And so the monks would gather at his door and sort of peer in to see all these voices of women that are not allowed in the monastery, why they were there. But when the monks actually peered into the room, they actually saw 8 or 15 lanterns and just him in the middle of this circle of lanterns. So he realized that he wasn't actually going to be able to accomplish properly in the monastery because they thought he was guilty of misconduct, which he actually wasn't. So he made sure that he was seen in displays of public drunkenness, visiting brothels, being abusive to shopkeepers, etc. And then so they said, okay, you have to leave the monastery for your misconduct. But again, it was superficial. But then when he actually attained, which he did a few days later in the forest, he actually started a campaign of like exorcism and a ritual ghost subjugation. So I agree with what Solar said. Like you see people who have higher level attainment and they're not out there being absolutely outrageous. Now, I do like Droyan. I do feel like Crazy Wisdom. I do feel like Guru Rinpoche related these kinds of ideas, which are not strictly bound within the conventional tantras, but they're definitely, there's room, skillfulness maybe that you could understand the Sambodhyagaya, the Twilight language, to relay some of these subtle truths, subtle elements of like conduct and proper behavior. And in my experience, that's true, but I'm not a Dharma teacher. I don't purport to be. I definitely would eschew anyone asking me about that stuff, but I think that, I agree with that. I think that there is this kind of solidity of the ground of where you arise through the praxis. And so doing that will actually sort of build up the capacity for bodhicitta, which I would consider axial in terms of like Tantra, but I'm not saying that is the view for everybody.
So I'll, going on that, if I think I understand correctly, like when you talk about the ground that you come up in, it's sort of like, wherever that is, there is a path upward, right? Wherever anyone is born on the earth, whatever they're born into, there is always a path upward. We don't always have our way to do everything, in a horizontal sense. We can't really change everything about that, but we can change ourselves in terms of our vertical relationship to the cosmos, and that is one of the things that one of the things that goes along with that is a acceptance of the ground that I came out of. That's where it is. I can't change that, right? There's things about our fundamental essence, right, that we can't change. We can't change, where we were born. We can't change our ethnicity. We can't change our sex. Fundamental things that can't be changed, and we can't change, what temples or churches we were taken into when we were 5 years old, and the impressions that we got and that we received. Nothing we can do about it. And one of the things I feel that we need to learn is how to embrace that, and there's a power in that. There's a power in the embracing of that allows us to look upwards and connect with that with the vertical current. When we fight with it, like, the typical thing that you imagine is, Luke Skywalker just hated that he was born on this shitty planet in the middle of nowhere, right? It's just like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. I just live in the Midwest and my life sucks. I wish I could go, to some wonderful land, right? Luke Skywalker wants to be involved in all these adventures and doesn't like, doesn't like where he's from. So the thing is when we go through these experiences, and I'm not saying you don't go anywhere and never try anything new, but the fundamental circumstances of our existence, if we come into conflict with them, then we just basically get stuck in this perpetual conflict that doesn't go anywhere.
I love that you said look upwards. This is a big part of my particular ideas of Tantra and Kabbalah both. There's a figure called Narukandro Dakini. So she's like the Scarlet Woman. Obviously, they all took inspiration from what they were seeing in Kashmir and Nepal in particular. And she always looks upwards. And this is a big part of understanding her Tantra. And she is actually going up. She's vertical. She's going straight up and outside the cube. You could even describe it as I've described it as before. And so I find that to be a very profound idea, that it is possible that all transformation, obviously there are immutable elements for sure, and I agree with you on all of those, but I do like the idea that there is a kind of a primordial ground, but we can also sort of take off from that. That's a much more tantric idea, like where you're kind of doing something else, not just staying in Rigpa, but maybe taking Rigpa with you. I don't know. That's not really the right way to describe it, but I often call it there's a solar and a lunar element to that, because you could say that the primordial sort of mind is at the moon, and you could say that the higher sort of will is at the sun. And so even the tantras describe it as that, they call it the fifth consciousness and the sixth consciousness. So there's a dialectical, a kind of how the channels would work in the body. There's a kind of luminous spark, you could say, that sort of goes downward and then also comes up in a figure eight perspective, if that's a figure eight motion. So I think that's really interesting, Paul. And then also Skywalker. Well, I love that you said that, because then I can make a little bit of a pun. One of the ways to understand who that figure is as a sky witch. So, sky walking, sky dancing, it's all the same, yeah. Maybe. Uh-huh. And interestingly, she actually leads the Upasaka through the Bardo experience. So you were talking about the transitional state between life and death. There's an idea that in Tantra, that once you go into the Bardo, you are still you in many ways. Maybe you have you would still contain some aggregates and what are called the Mahabhutas, which are the elemental proportions in your body, of which there are obviously, we would consider them to be 5, like fire, earth, air, water, and kasha or void. And so once you're in the Bardo state, the idea is that you look for the deity that you practiced in this life to sort of enter with them into the mind stream. That's obviously a more Buddhist idea. That's not necessarily a Santana Dharma idea, but there is kind of an overlap, I thought, with some of the Advaita. They clearly see things differently, but I think that there's a little bit of overlap with that.
I feel like there has to be kind of a middle way here, right? Where we can we can sort of acknowledge the power, the potency, and just like the kind of like conditioned existence of all of these various like facets of our sort of constructed identities, right? Like who we are in this kind of compounded sense, right? Age, race, sex, location, all that stuff, right? But as long as we're looking at this from, again, so this is from the Dharmic perspective, right? We're saying that like none of those things are who I am in any kind of an absolute thing. Like the thing that I am, a quote unquote huge air quotes there, is luminous emptiness, is cognition itself, if you want to say. However, that doesn't mean that those things just poof out of existence for me and I warp into the void or something like that, obviously, or that I cease to exist. That's a horrible translation of nibbana, right? And it's not what we mean. We can say that these things can be incorporated into a sort of like field of creative play, right? And of skillful play, right? Like that these things in fact form like the very kind of sort of like base elements of our practice. They're not outside of practice. And in fact, they're not outside of nirvana itself, right? So it's not a denial of all of these conditioned, contingent elements of quote unquote who we are, but we don't engage with them as though we actually really truly were those things. We recognize that they are these sort of factors of a sort of non-self, right? A self that does not have an absolute ultimate reality, but it's like the mode we're engaging with, like in the moment. It's not a denial. Does that make sense? It's really like, I mean, I'm not, again, it's a cliche, right? But it is truly like a middle position on that.
Right.
Sorry, Paul.
I was going to say, so yeah, it's like the aim is not to destroy all of the parts of my ego, my personality, and the parts of myself that I know I'm really not. But just to not identify with them, that's a challenge, right? Just don't identify with them. Just remember, come back to remembering, remembering myself. And you really hit on it, Solar, with the who am I? That question of, asking who I am. Kind of takes me back to that, because you realize, well, I'm not actually this or that. I just am,
Oh yeah, I agree. I think that was a great point. And I would argue, this is just for me, but I would argue that definitely Buddha Dharma takes a, Madhyamika middle positionality. But that's obviously just me, and that's obviously, I practice Tantra, so it's like a left-hand path adjacent, maybe not quite the same ideas, but definitely the sorcery practices, that's an overlap. So we always try and like bring it back into the middle, but you might have like you might use the polarity, as Paul brought up, like the currents. You might use the horizontal currents or the horizontal polarities to sort of bring yourself back into the middle from either extreme. So in terms of like absolute self, I am no longer comfortable saying that there is either an absolute self. I've never been comfortable with that, but I've always thought that I was very sure for a long time that there was definitely not an absolute self. And I agree with that, but I also think that there's more subtlety. And obviously I do credit Solar for like introducing me to some of the left-hand path and Egyptian soul complex ideas, which I had no idea about. But there is a tantric overlap. It's so text dependent, it's instruction dependent, it's translation dependent. And it's really, so much of this is self-reflexive. And one of the ideas, Paul, I've been exploring a lot is there's a tantric idea that the self-reflexivity of like recognizing yourself and your own positionality is actually the inner guru, the Mahakala, the time king. But he is not he's not like the final boss or the final deity, or he's not even the final self. He is just like if you want to use a very tantric flowery language, you could say that he is just the laughing king of the carnal ground. He's there, just like Euro is there. Just like nirvana is also the carnal ground, you could say, because we exist in a way, at least conceptually there. So no, I think that it requires a lot of self-reflexivity, and I think that that is what the sort of, like, to go back to Miller, but I think that is what the benefit of that story is. It's teaching you not necessarily that you have to have a living guru, although Vajrayana places a great emphasis on this in general, not always, but certainly institutional Dharma does. But it's also teaching you, like, Vajrasattva is the primordial guru. Like, that is how the Guhya Garbha, the original Tantra of, like, the higher Tantras, that is how it is understood. There is a self-reflexivity that becomes then the guru. So that is what is the corrective and or the adversarial element is within your own mind.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree with that. I think you have to keep in mind that in these writings where people where they say you need to find a guru, you have to find a guru, or else, I mean, that's the only way. They're always writing in a time and a place where there are lots of gurus, lots of.
Paul, you cut out for a second.
Yeah, he's out for me too.
Hey, Paul, sorry about that. You cut out for a second. No big deal.
I don't know what happened.
There were many gurus. Obviously, the
lots of gurus.
Of gurus passed. Yeah.
Yes. They got mad at me. They heard me talking smack about.
You're trying to put him out of business after the fact.
Right.
They don't like
we gotta take him out. But I was gonna say that, I think that inner voice, that inner guidance that we can sometimes connect with, that's the thing right there. And I mean, that's one of the things that I liked about Secret of the Golden Flower. That's my reading of the Bhagavad Gita. That's what I get out of it. There's a point where Arjuna refers to Krishna, he's talking to Krishna, and he says, I recognize you as my ultimate guru. Well, Krishna is his own higher consciousness also, right? Krishna is an avatar, and he's also Brahma, but he's also, your own individual higher consciousness. So he recognizes that as his higher guru. So that's really the aim. And a good guru, like a literal walking around on the street kind of guru, a good guru would help you get in touch with that anyhow. So it's really the end game of it. What I have a question, Jin. How do you define the word Tantra?
Okay, well, Solar has heard this, so I apologize, Solar. But I think of it as, this is not necessarily the most. There is an academic argument, as like a scholarship argument you absolutely can make, and I have read it before, so it's not something self-originating or anything. But when we interviewed Gregory Peters, I said, okay, so Tantra can also be extended in Sanskrit to be Tantara, meaning the sort of weaving or to stretch between the stars, but directly relating it to the goddess Tara, both in a Buddhist sense and in the Puranic sense. Because if you really understand the Puranas are the outer density or the outer cosmological layer that sort of give rise to Tantra. There's a deep connection between the two texts, and there's even Sambodhyagaya, twilight language, within the Puranas, which are considered to be part of Orthodox or whatever that is, sort of like the Santana Dharma as it is understood since Adi Shankara in the 10th century. So she is the receiver. She receives just like she perceives the hearer. Tara is the hearer, just like Milarepa in a way. And so she is actually the receiver of the Tantras. She receives the Tantras from Shiva, if you understand her, by Rava. And he says, you need to do these practices. And so she does these practices, and she goes to live on the carnal ground, and she does all the practices, and she becomes a Dakini, a sky witch. And through that, she is then sort of able to move the Leela forth. Like you were talking about the divisions, Paul, like from 1 to 2 to 3. So Tara is always considered like the 2. So she is kind of like, it's her bodhicitta nature that sort of allows her to turn the wheel for like the second time. That's how the Puranas would describe it. So that's how, I'm sorry, that was long, but that is how I understand Tantra. I understand it to be directly related to like the sky witches or the Tara, or however you want to understand them. And one of the interesting things is, this is deep, and this is not like necessarily normie Tantra, but a lot of people do understand the three roots to be represented by the quote unquote guru, but you don't have to say guru. You can actually say Buddha, Deva, and Dakini. So any one of those figures can actually be all three. Like some people, like Varupa, that's why I brought it up, because he's actually initiated into higher Tantra through Nirvaimya, through one of the sky witches. And so for him, that's who his guru, Deva, and Dakini is she's all three. And that is very common. That's very common among Tantric and Vajrayana practitioners to this day. It just depends on your school and like who's instructed you. Like I've talked to Solar about this, but like I received Lamrim instructions. Lamrim is very different than like what the Gelugpa do in Lamdre, which is the graduated instruction method. Lamrim is more non-dual, and you sort of are taken based on your quote unquote karmic capacity, and you're given not necessarily more instruction necessarily, but you can be given additional instruction based on your capacity. So you just sort of come to a place, but it has to be married to practice. Like it's so important. Like if you are not doing the practice, I always say this, but if you're not doing the practices, that you cannot say you're practicing Tantra. At least like my kind of Tantra. I don't know about the other kinds, but for like the Anuttara Yoga Tantras, like you have to be doing it every single day.
So does
or
it
at
mean
least
like
trying.
a certain kind of seeking a certain kind of state of receptivity?
So one of the ideas, and this definitely, well, I won't say definitely because I don't know, but I think it differs from Dzogchen significantly in that there is like a dialogical relationship with the deity itself, because the deity itself is also luminous and massless, just like we are. And there's a point where we can consider ourselves, quote unquote, the same, but we're actually not the same because the deity has a Vajra body and we don't have a Vajra body. So the whole thing is to cultivate that Vajra body, but it is through the word. So every deity is basically a mandala unto themselves. Like they are their own sort of like cartographic map of the multiverse. But they also represent a bija or a series of bija or their mantras. So when you're speaking the mantra, you're speaking the deity into existence. But the deity isn't just arising because you believe the deity is there. There is something else. There's an other power. So this gets into like Shentong and Rantong and Gentong and all these kinds of sort of sectarian differences of like what is actually happening. But I would say that there is a relationship between the deity and yourself, but you're understanding the deity as also having other things. You're using the sadhana as visualization. Like you're following the text as in you're seeing the signs and marks that are associated with the deity. And then there's obviously layers of meaning of why those signs and marks appear with that deity and the numbers and the colors, and then the mantra itself. But the mantra itself is also representative of the primordial word. So I like to use the word dialogical, and I don't know if that answers your question, Paul, but the idea is to be able to sort of send out your consciousness like an arrow or a chariot, or sometimes it's described as a velocity into the multiverse, three world system, and be able to accomplish certain things. So it's very much like magic in one way.
And it's deity connected. I heard you say deity. Tantra is like a deity connection.
Well, Anuttara Yoga, like the way that we practice, the way that I practice Tantra is deity yoga, Maha Yoga. So for me, that is where I place the primary importance. But that's obviously just one branch. There's many branches. Not everybody uses a deity. I'm not saying anyone has to do that. I'm just saying this is just simply my experience and my practice.
Okay.
I
Gotcha.
feel like that's a fairly characteristic, like distinctive, right? Like especially if we're sort of like trying to distinguish between something like Dzogchen. So even if like you and I, you as a tantric, me as a Dzogchenpa, even if we're ending up in the same state, we've arrived at that state through completely different means, right? And the deity practice is the sort of doing on your part that I am not doing. And also, too, on the formation of the Vajra body, this is something else uh, conspicuously that sounds like doing from a Dzogchen perspective. So sorry, for that. But so that's something that we're going to cultivate. We would call it like rainbow body, right? In Togyal, which is the sort of like quote unquote fourth and final stage of Dzogchen practice, although it gets a little messier than that. But critically, and this is why I want to go back to the deity thing, we aren't going to be using the sort of dialogical deity practice to do that. We have other methods of doing that. Now, again, historically, maybe that distinction doesn't quite hold up because you generally wouldn't be just rocketing into Dzogchen practice, skipping over like all the other tantric practices. It would usually come at the sort of culmination of decades of practice. But definitely, like in the modern context, even if we're hitting a lot of the same states and we're ultimately doing a lot of the same stuff, like Togyal in a lot of systems will sound a lot like completion stage tantra, right? If you just compare like the yogas to one another, right? You're like, okay, you're doing this with these channels and this light, and okay, like very, very homologous in a lot of ways. But yeah, it's not necessarily usually going to have that deity component that, to me, as a non-tantric practitioner, seems to distinguish tantric practice in one strong way.
No, thank you for that clarification, Solar. I appreciate that. I do make a distinguishment between rainbow body, clear light body, and Vajra body. That is just me, and maybe that's just semantic and conceptual bullshit, but that is how I've always understood it. But maybe that is wrong, and I'm open to being flexible on that issue. But I do consider them distinct. Just for me.
I'm also just trying to generalize enough to like facilitate a conversation. So yeah, please, like don't crucify me over the particulars.
I'm not.
I figure that's not.
No, we're all good.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate it. And I think it's good for people to hear it too. Like that it's okay to have like slight differences of view and still like recognize that we're arising maybe on the same ground. I apologize, Paul. I didn't mean to derail on that subject. I wanted to really address your question thoroughly, though, and just say, like, yeah, there is an important deity component, but I would actually relate it more closely to tapasya or the Zoroastrian practices of like the inner sort of luminosity, inner reflection, inner light. Mm-hmm. So that even is something of what Solar was saying, like where you are visualizing the sort of like channels and the removing blockages and allowing the lights, which are also words, but allowing like the light to sort of travel through unencumbered and unobstructed. So that's really what the deity is for. It's really for that internal and also cultivation of consciousness. It's not really for inherently doing magic. It is really considered to be unless you're doing a specifically what we would call activity practice. So I think that's another interesting kind of overlap with Zoroastrianism, where they would worship certain deities to accomplish certain things in the world. Tantra obviously preserves some elements of this, like more akin to like how the Vedas would do those. It's not really like a yajna or anything, but it is like you do the activity deities and you understand them as going out into the world and performing certain functions. But really at the end of it, you're supposed to sort of bring them back and sort of enter them back into like the mind stream of the Buddha. So I would say it's both things are happening. Like you are doing magic, sorcery, but then also it's supposed to be largely based internally and in consciousness.
No, thank you for that. Thank you for that. I'm on a quest to understand the meaning of the word Tantra, the meanings of Tantra. I had always just sort of associated the term with sex magic way back when, And coming from a Western occultism perspective,
Oh shit, the taquinis are mad at us.
Talk about sex magic on Threshold Saints. This is what happens. Should have warned him.
I know, that's why we don't do it usually.
Yeah, we don't do Karma Mudra here.
oh hey,
Invocation, Solar said it, invocation of sex magic. It turns the aether wave into unstable territory.
I don't know what you guys were talking about while I was not in the room. If I was even not in the room, I'm not sure where I was. But so Ram Dass says somewhere that Tantra is using any kind of object for focus, like for meditation, but that will help enhance your experience. Any sort of thing, right? So I mean that's anything from like a bell that's sitting on the desk or something I put on the wall or an image or a sigil or a symbol or whatever. But of course then an object like that is like has the danger of, well, you get identified with it, you get attached to it, and you start thinking that it has the power, all the power is in that. So I thought that's a nice definition of it. But then I saw another definition of Tantra, that it's utilizing any sort of pleasurable experience as a part of your inner growth.
Bliss state. That's what we'd call it.
Yeah.
Bliss
Yeah.
state.
Yeah.
It's a very important part of certain tantras. Now, I don't practice a bliss tantra personally, but the idea of the bliss consciousness is present in all higher tantras. So it doesn't. So okay. So we'll just for the normies, we'll just say karma mudra, sex tantra. You do not have to practice this with a consort. So it can also be an inner visualization. So obviously the pranaparamita or the paramita is also your breath. So the consort can also be thought of as your breath. And I love that you brought up like ritual implements, because in higher tantra, not necessarily Anuttara Yoga Tantra, but like even Charya Yoga Tantras, tantras have like a classification system of how they're sort of hierarchically ordered. And so each of the implements actually has a primordial word associated with it. So the idea, Paul, is that if you get really good at sort of building the mind palace, like Milarepa was, building this kind of, Zoroastrian, or we'll say like a post-Zoroastrian platform for fire worship, you're supposed to actually do that in your mind. And you will understand all your ritual implements, which I have some, but you really understand them as fundamentally appearing. Oh, shit. Again, apologies, Paul, that was my fault. But you understand them as arising on that same primordial ground with you. And you understand them as, you're exactly right. You don't identify them with their quote unquote material body. You actually understand them to have the same quality as the deity, which is the primordial word. So for me, Tantra is a ritual grammar that comes out of what we would call the Pranaparamita Sutras. Pranaparamita Sutras, Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, they sound Mahayana in orientation, but they're actually esoteric Mahayana. So they're kind of like this more, you could say, inner temple layer of Buddhism. But in and of themselves, through Sambodhya, through Twilight language, they actually extracted these texts called the Dharanis. Dharanis are basically spell texts, is basically what they are. And then so the Dharanis were compiled in the Sadhana Mala it's very contentious, and a lot of we'll call them like Hindus or Advaita, or like people who would consider themselves to practice Santana Dharma, don't like the more Buddhist epistemological sort of argument of like where Tantra came from. But we would say that the Pranaparamita Sutras are actually a goddess called Pranaparamita, but it's also your breath, but it's also something else. So it's sort of like a secret wisdom. So if you have a really good Sanskrit knowledge or Chinese or Siddham script or any of the, magical Tibetan or magical languages that they would use to write these tantras, you can actually, the idea is that you can recreate from scratch in totality all tantra from Pranaparamita Sutras. So for me, tantra is simply just the magical Diamond Thunder Vajra methodology of the sutras. I connect it very deeply to Mahayana personally, but this is, again, not everybody's view, but a lot of people who practice tantra, who are much higher level than me, do agree with like my framing of it. So I'm just giving it as that. That's just my opinion of what tantra is. It's a sort of taking the ritual grammars of, yes, sometimes even the Vedas and sometimes other even Buddhist practices, and taking them to the carnal ground, very literally taking them to the carnal ground. And you will do the deity practices there because for various reasons, but because that is also a way to like break conceptual thinking, to watch like bodies being cremated. So again, taking it back to like the Parsi Tower of Silence, you don't burn the body, but in Tantra, you do cremate the body. So wouldn't it be maybe ritually efficacious if you use that flame, that very, very impure flame, to do higher deity practices? That's kind of the idea of what Tantra is.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's very, very interesting.
Okay, Paul, so we didn't discuss anything about music, and I know you wanted to. So why don't we end on that note? No pun.
So the musical connection with all of this is I've been working on some new stuff that's all like solar based music that I'm working with on acoustic guitar and stuff like that. So it's been a long time coming, I guess. is where I'm going with that. So I did. I don't know how much we talked about it in the past, or how much is out there, but I was in a touring Gothic band in the '90s called Morphine Angel, and then in the early 2000s, I started doing more industrial stuff with a project called Asmodeus X, and around 2008, 2009 or so, I just stopped doing it completely. I just stopped doing everything. And the reason was because I felt that I had become I don't know, kind of like dead to it. So I got more and more into electronic stuff and programming and things like that. And I felt this sort of disconnect. I felt this sort of disconnect with the music from the vibrations of it. So a few years later, then I got back together with like some of my bros from Asmodeus X, and we started jamming again. But I was like, let's just use guitars and acoustic guitars and just sing with our real voices and stuff, and went down that route. And I did that for several years, and put out a couple of little singles here and there, digital singles and stuff like that, but it never really put a lot into it. And that kind of ended a while back. But as I'm working on these new ideas that are coming together in this book, I've been having like this surge of like musical inspiration that I've been working on. I realize that this has like been a recurring theme for me, because some of my previous like writings and stuff, there was almost always some sort of musical thing going along at the same time. So it seems like there's some kind of connection there.
Yeah, what do you think it is about the sort of I don't know, when the initiatory journey or process seems to kind of accelerate and intensify, that there seems to be this kind of like, I don't know, upswelling or outpouring of creativity, even if it isn't always so explicitly like linked, like with the sort of the magical or the initiatory work in this really literal way. You're not necessarily composing you know, acoustic songs to a Huramasa or something like that, right? But like, why does it so often in like your case seem to be like bound up, do you think? Like, do you have any, have you had, you know, the opportunity to kind of reflect on that over the decades?
Well, I think it has to do, going back to the heart, and it goes back to emotional center, that really, you know, where that deep inspiration comes from. And both of those things are what really fuel, like we were talking earlier, about conscience, are really fueled by that. So I think that has to do with it. But also at the same time, there's sort of a, you know, there's like a realization that there's there's not that much that you can do about it. And I think you touched on this with Dzogchen too, like that, this idea that you can't really like do anything. And for the most part, we just are reacting to things, and I can't force this higher, experience, or this higher material to like come down on me, but I can work to prepare myself for it. And that's a lot of the actual the practice and stuff that, that I talk about with, you know, stillness and stillness, silence, and meditation practice and stuff like that. In many ways, is just preparing us for this experience, when it does happen, when it does appear. You know, we're like waiting, you know, waiting for the man, so to speak.
Do you think that that preparatory work in particular allows the sort of the creative spark to kind of burn, I don't know, more authentically, or like in a less contrived way, right? Because there's more of it is coming from that kind of like intuitive, like heart, like higher kind of vibration. Sorry, I'm sounding really new age right now, as opposed to sort of your, yeah, you're trying to like, you know, just grip it really hard and like sort of wrench something into existence, kind of with, you know, like, I don't know, because that's I again, I never attempted to do this professionally. I did an MFA, so I was a quote unquote professional poet for all of like a few years, right? And I burned myself out completely, to the point where I'm like, God is calling me to silence. So I just walked away from it, walked away from publishing. I'm driving a truck in the Midwest, right? But yeah, I sort of I feel like I felt that transition into the sort of deadness of it very
Hmm.
very quickly, right? Like in my case, and since I've been doing a lot of this my own work, I can kind of feel that like stirring back to life. Even something that again I sort of I have no ambitions for it or whatever, but it's just kind of there. But I'm wondering if that kind of tracks it all with you, you know. um
I
yeah
resonate with
yeah.
a lot of what you're talking about. I resonate with a lot of what you're talking about. And one thing that I think every artist struggles with is the actual experience of this work, right? And then the question of, well, what happens when someone else sees it? Because any kind of art, any sort of thing that you do like that with art, it it indicates there's going to be a product, someone's going to see it, and then you're like, well, what do people want to read? What do people want to listen to? You know, and it while the experience starts us, it's like we kind of go into the experience or pulled into the experience with this sort of pureness, right? This sort of not disattachment from everything, and just this inner sort of feeling, and at the same time it's pulling us out, and it's tempting us, right, into, attaching and identifying with the work, considering what other people will think about it, and all of these things. So there's this struggle, and maybe I'm just describing that. I'm just describing that there's a evolutionary and an involutionary current in it. But we know from experience, like you said, you too much on the involutionary current of it, too much on what pulls us out. Um, is eventually it can be fatiguing, and we have a need to cut off from it. So I've found more than anything that has helped me to sort of ride out the roller coaster of these things. And we've been talking about it in terms of art, but I mean, it's there's any number of things we do in life that take us in this direction, but is establishing that daily personal meditation practice, that daily first thing in the morning private, stillness and silence practice sort of creates this other rhythm in our lives, or in my life at least, in my experience, that helps sort of like navigate the extreme ups and downs, that we can have.
I love that. And thank you for both of you for sharing that. And I think that is very interesting because it is obviously the equinox today, and it is AppCon submission day. So that was weighing heavily on my mind. Paul, that's an online sort of like lit mag. I'm not like the poet that Solar is, but I'm trying to dabble. And so we'll see how that goes, but I appreciate it. And I think that this was a really far-ranging conversation, and I didn't necessarily intend to monopolize it as much as I did. And I apologize to you both for that. I do agree with the heart and the solar. Like obviously in like Kabbalah, Tiferet is associated with the heart. Hildegard of Bingen wrote a whole tractate in German. I don't read German, but she called The Music of the Spheres. And so she talks a lot about like this sort of like emanating from the heart, which is very like Pico della Mirandola, like Christian Kabbalah, sort of like the higher consciousness emanating from there. So I do think that there is something profound, true, and beautiful about the heart. And so, and the sort of like unfolding like a flower, maybe even a golden flower of what that can become. Yeah. So.
Very good. Very well stated. I like that.
Well, I'm trying, Paul. Thank you. I have to, I have a lot of competition with Solar, so I have to, keep it going. So Paul, please plug your website and your podcast so everybody can go reference like the things that we talked about and the things that we said. And I'll make sure that all your links are included in the show notes. And Solar, if you have any final words, you can have them. That's totally fine.
Sure. Let me just jump in and then I'll let Paul plug. So yeah, again, thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this discussion. It's always a pleasure with both of you guys. I do want to say, so some of the stuff that we didn't get to, not just the diet stuff, but also, because how I'm an eminently practical guy, right? I love talking about the sort of like nitty gritty, like concrete aspects of someone's practice, even if it's fairly divergent from mine, whatever, it doesn't really matter. Those kinds of things are incredible to me. I would love to hear, on the basis of not just our now 2 conversations that we've had together, but also on the basis of like what you shared in your last book of The Golden Flower, right? You had sort of accomplished or sort of reached this point where on one hand, it's like you've reached the top of the mountain, but then what you realize from that vantage point is that that's really what allows a certain sort of new phase of the process to start. And now you're a few years like on the other side of that, right? And I think a lot of people, not just myself, would really love to hear kind of like an update, like how have things changed sort of like since that sort of like peak foundational experience that you described in that book. On not just like a sort of conceptual level, but just like in terms of like day-to-day practice, experiences, just like how your body is responding to things. Again, how that intersects with like, sort of like dietary, intuitions and things like, just where you've kind of gone with that. So at the risk of getting fired from Threshold Saints here, I would love to have you back at some point once again, to sort of like further that discussion. Like anyway, so I look forward to that if it's in the cards. And again, thanks for having me on today, guys.
Thanks, Solar. I definitely is in the cards. How can I fire you for asking him on a third time? So that's perfect.
No, that's excellent. So yeah, okay. So we'll do a third time, and we're gonna start out talking about diet because there's a lot in there, and Solar 100%. You know, that several years on the other side of those experiences I was talking about in Second Awakening, and that's a huge part of this new book that I'm working on also. All of that is like arising from that, and diet is a huge thing. I've ended up like totally carnivore for like going on 4 years now. And it's just absolutely changed my life. But I never would have like come to that direction had it not been for this this sort of inner guidance that we've like talked about a few times. It wasn't because I just because I saw a YouTube video about it and said, hey, this looks like a way to piss people off. But I was just sort of like led to it, and it's been really kind of miraculous. But next time we'll get more into that because then it connects back with a lot of the historical and esoteric things that we've been touching upon. But to plug my stuff, I'll tell people the best place to find me is on X, and I am at Paul Fredric on X. That's PaulFredric. I spell it in a special way. And the website is ibeelzebub.com. And the podcast you can find on YouTube as Paul Fredric or Daemonosophy. And it's also on, you can get the audio of it on, searching for the same on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any place else where they do podcasts, a lot of different places. And that's about it. Those are the main things. I think that's enough for people to find their way around. The books are available. The last book, Second Awakening, that's on Amazon. And yeah, so that's good. So, and I welcome anyone who's interested in any of the ideas that we're talking about to come and connect.
Paul's a great guy. I will second that. It was very synchronous. It was very weird and like funny, and just was a great connection. And so I do have to say thank you to Solar for that, for suggesting you as a guest, Paul. But we had actually followed each other for quite some time, and I've always been interested in your work. And so I'm really happy to have you on multiple times. And obviously, you are a saint. At least on the show, and welcome anytime. The threshold is always open, as well as Solar. So thank you both. Really, really appreciate it. A great conversation. I love that we can be divergently intellectual in our own distinct ways, but sort of reach a middle ground. So again, thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you both. Keep fighting the good fight.